all, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you here at the Department of Politics, Languages and International Studies. And I would also like to extend a warm welcome on behalf of the Institute for Policy Research, which is actually co-hosting this little conference today. Excellent that so many of you have made it, despite the storm yesterday. There seem to have been travel disruptions from Manchester, which imply that there's going to be a bit of rescheduling. But nevertheless, what we want to discuss is a very important issue, and an issue that curiously, or perhaps not so curiously, has in recent years slipped down or seems to have slipped down the political priority list quite a bit, as the UK, and of course not only the UK together with other European governments is fully focused on the agenda of re-stimulating economic growth, of getting consumers to spend more, and also on balancing their budgetary deficits. Now, of course, all of this, balancing the budgetary deficits and getting consumers to spend again, is, of course, very much about sustainability, and it is very much part of the agenda of sustainability. But one might argue that, despite many contestations to the contrary, it is very much, or first and foremost, about sustaining the established economic structures, and that is, one might say, sustaining the unsustainable. And that is exactly what we want to talk about in this little conference here today. Sustained unsustainability, barriers to transformative action. And perhaps one of the reasons why we have all come to this conference is that whenever we allow ourselves to think about these issues, and that is to think about these issues for more than 3 minutes, and also slightly outside of the patterns of thinking that are ready-made for us, in which we are supposed to think about such issues, most of us are probably well and very painfully aware that in a whole range of ways, our established social practices and our established socio-economic order is quite evidently unsustainable, but that we are nevertheless deeply committed to trying to sustain this order anyway. Not least because we cannot really imagine any genuinely attractive alternative, and any alternative that, on top of being attractive, we also regard as pragmatically viable or as politically viable. When we allow ourselves to think about that, we get profoundly worried, I think, profoundly worried about some kind of schizophrenia that has obviously taken hold. And that is what we want to try to unpack a little bit with our conference today. And before we move into the papers, I briefly want to say a few more words of contextualization. Sustainability politics and the project of addressing the multiple sustainability crises that our contemporary consumer societies are having to confront, and are indeed confronting, and transforming these societies into more sustainable societies, whatever that may be, is one of the key research themes here in the Department of Languages, Politics, Languages and International Studies, and also within the Bath Institute for Policy Research. An awful lot of sustainability research is also going on elsewhere in this university, beyond these 2 units which I have referred to. But one of the specialities that we pursue within this department and also within the institute is research into the question why it is actually so difficult to move from the current state of unsustainability into something more sustainable, towards more sustainable forms of living and socio-economic organization. And this work is inspired by the fact that the problem of unsustainability has, after all, although of course not under this very name, sustainability, been known for several decades. at least one might say since the Limits to Growth report presented by the Club of Rome in 1972. And since then, we have witnessed the emergence of quite powerful environmental movements, and we have witnessed the institutionalization of environmental politics at the national level, at the international level, and we have witnessed the emergence of quite a number of policy suggestions, many of which invested a lot of trust into technological innovation, into efficiency revolutions, and into improved strategies for resource management. But although these policies have by no means been entirely unsuccessful, clearly they have not, the sustainability crisis has continued to become ever more pressing. And the issue of global warming just added another dimension to it. And when the banking and the financial crisis since 2008 and the euro crisis and the global economic crisis that emerged in its wake provided more dramatic evidence than ever that our established structures are unsustainable, there was a lot of hope and there was a lot of optimism that the coincidence of the banking crisis and the climate crisis would actually provide us with a unique opportunity to address both of them together in one go and more effectively than ever, using their coincidence as a more powerful than ever stimulus to move the economy and to move society into or towards more sustainable forms or patterns of organization. Now, at least for the time being, very little of that hope seems to have come true. One might in fact say that the banking crisis and the economic crisis have stimulated exactly the opposite, and that is a concerted effort to reconfirm what, however, we know is unsustainable. And on top of that, there has recently been a remarked loss of confidence, not only in the achievability of global agreements about climate change, for example, but also in a whole range of other narratives, which were, I think, once a major source of eco-political hope. I'm referring here to, of course, the narrative of technological innovation, of efficiency revolutions, the whole narrative of ecological modernization and its techno-managerial resource efficiency promise, the promise of the Green New Deal, the expectation also, I think, that transition towns would be a starting point for a profound structural change that eventually would reorganize societies as a whole. Then, of course, the narrative of political consumerism, the narrative of shopping for sustainability, and the notion or the idea, the hope that notions or ideas of ecological citizenship and alternative hedonism are already emerging. Many people have been arguing these cases, and certainly we like to hear these cases because they are narratives of reassurance and narratives of hope. But there is in literature a marked lack of confidence in these alternative strategies of pathways. None of these movements, none of these narratives, none of these agendas seem to be likely to initiate and then to propel anything like the kind of transition, transformation that at least our traditional notion of sustainability says is required in order to become sustainable, or to prevent serious threats, as it sometimes says in literature, even to prevent the possible annihilation of mankind as a whole, because that, of course, is one of the constant turmoil, so to speak, which is being mobilized in eco-political discourse. Now, on the one hand, the recognition that all of our concerted efforts have so far not managed to put modern societies onto a trajectory of sustainability might make us terribly frustrated. But on the other hand, it sets crucially important new research agendas, I think, which do not actually leave us very much time for indulging in frustration and pessimism. And in fact, quite evidently, not all is yet lost. After all, at least for the time being, the predictions of large-scale catastrophe, despite the train disruptions yesterday, the predictions of social collapse, and even perhaps the end of the human species, which environmental campaigners have always been making in order to mobilize political action, have so far not come true. At least not here, and at least not at the predicted scale. So that, in a sense, ironically, might be, again, a reason of hope. As a matter of fact, contrary to the predictions of catastrophe and collapse, it seems, at least for the time being, quite obviously possible to sustain the unsustainable. And whilst certain things, such as, for example, the established welfare arrangements and established notions of social equality, social justice, social inclusion, or also the belief that nature ought to be protected as an entity of intrinsic value, clearly certain things, such as these beliefs, are not sustainable. But, nevertheless, at least for some, and I suppose for all of us, we can live quite comfortably for the time being with sustained unsustainability. And as we are so firmly committed to our established values and to our established lifestyles and patterns of economic organization, and as it is indeed, as it has often been said, much easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of consumer capitalism, there is a new agenda, there is a new research project which demands us to explore how exactly it is possible to manage this crisis of unsustainability and to, at least for the time being, continue to sustain the unsustainable. And sustainability research, therefore, I think, quite pragmatically, has shifted its attention from radical change, of course, that discourse hasn't disappeared, towards adaptation and towards resilience. And these two terms are, of course, about sustaining and adapting to unsustainability. Put differently, whilst the discourses of structural transformation and of radical change have by no means disappeared, we have quite evidently moved from the earlier politics of sustainability to a new politics and a new policy of unsustainability, which is first and foremost about managing the apparently inevitable social and ecological implications of sustained unsustainability. Now, whilst policymakers at the local level, at the national level, at the international level, as well as academic advisors who help them to devise evidence-based policies, are fully absorbed by this task of managing the apparently inevitable social and ecological implications of sustained unsustainability. That is, by the task to practically organize adaptation and to enhance societal capacities of resilience. Eco-political activists, unless of course they are paid, for example, by the American climate denial industry, will campaign against such policies of adaptation and resilience, and they will instead see their first objective in trying to break out of this politics of unsustainability. Being activists, they will call for action, they will call for rapid action, they will call for radical action. But looking back onto more of 40 years of eco-political activism, we may wonder how much reason there is actually today to believe that their activism is more likely to send us onto a trajectory of sustainability than it has done in the past. Now this is exactly where we are coming in with this conference, I think. This is where academic research comes in, and that tries to enhance the effectiveness of both policy making and eco-political activism, and with that purpose in mind, at least for the moment, takes a step back. Takes a step back and tries to get a better understanding of what it actually is that renders leaving the trajectory of unsustainability so incredibly difficult for both policymakers and for activists. So at this conference, Sustained Unsustainability, Barriers to Transformative Action, we are, in a sense, shifting, at least for a moment, the emphasis from rapid action towards deep inquiry. And the objective of doing that is, of course, to help both policymakers and activists to get a better understanding of where exactly these barriers to transformative action are, so that they then may possibly be able to devise political approaches which are more effective in achieving genuinely transformative action than either side has managed to do so far. We have activists here today, we have got policymakers, we have got researchers whose work is strongly policy oriented, and we have academics who are trying to understand what exactly the now prevalent politics of unsustainability implies. And together, looking from a variety of different analytical perspectives, we are going to investigate what these barriers to transformative action are. Needless to say that there is a much larger number of barriers of transformative action than we can look at here today. We only can look from a small number of perspectives or a small number of barriers. But part of the agenda of this conference is here that we try to break out of the somewhat compartmentalized debates which are going on in different academic quarters. And for this purpose, we have got Eric Swinredo, who is a political geographer, actually, from Manchester, who's going to present. We've got Bas Verplanken, who is a psychologist, who's going to present from his perspective. We've got Olivier Taieb, who's a social psychologist, who's working a lot on populism and right-wing extremism. And we've got myself, who is, or who I am, or whatever the right expression is, a political sociologist and an eco-political theorist. Now, for each paper, we have a discussant, we have a formal discussant. The papers are supposed to last something like 30 minutes, then the discussant will take the paper to bits. That's at least the function of the critical discussant, and then we should have plenty of time for discussion from the floor, and at the end of the day we will hopefully manage to pull some strings together. Now, there are a few tiny little issues of housekeeping. I already referred to the storm yesterday. The storm implies that Eric is not here yet. Eric couldn't make it because all trains were cancelled yesterday, so we are in the middle of the sustainability crisis. It's not a catastrophe, but we manage, we adapt. Eric is going to come in, well, hopefully, the course of the morning, and so therefore we will shift his paper to the first afternoon session. That is, where's my 2:30, I think it is. Is that right? We will, rather than with Eric, start with Bas Verplanken's paper now, and then Olivier Taieb will go second, and after the lunch break, hopefully, if Eric has then arrived, Eric will continue, and I will be the last on the list. A couple of other things. There is a list. We didn't take formal register, but if you want to enter your name and email address and institutional not affiliation, what is it? Affiliation. Do that on the list. We may have email circulars afterwards, and if you want to be on the list, put your names